3 races into the 2022 season, and the narrative that this title battle is going to be between Ferrari and Red Bull has only strengthened as the season has progressed so far, with reliability issues being the only reason that Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc haven't finished 1-2 in every single race this season. And on top of that, Charles Leclerc has just been incredibly consistent. Ferrari sitting top of the tree in terms of the constructors, and of course Charles Leclerc sitting top of the Drivers' Championship as well. Max Verstappen's been the unlucky candidate. 2 DNFs over 3 races has kind of cost him from being in the mix with Charles Leclerc. But today's video, I want to talk about the other 2 drivers in those top teams, because at the moment, everybody's talking about Charles Leclerc versus Max Verstappen, how that's going to play out over the next 20 races, and which one of these 2 is going to win the Drivers' Championship. Now, there are 2 other drivers in the top teams as well, Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez, who are actually having a pretty decent season as well, just behind, and could put themselves in this title battle. But I want to talk about why I think people are kind of sleeping on Carlos Sainz and Sergio Perez a little bit, and maybe why they're not quite of the caliber of Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen going into this 2022 season with 20 races still to go. Let's talk about Carlos Sainz to begin with, because it's been a pretty good start to the season. 2 podiums back to back from Carlos Sainz, the first time he's ever done that in his Formula 1 career, and sits 3rd currently in the driver's standings after 3 races. It's all going fairly well for Carlos Sainz if you're looking at it subjectively in terms of his finishes for Ferrari. And let's not forget, this is a driver that was brand new to Ferrari in 2022 and managed to outscore Leclerc in his first season. Yes, there was a little bit of luck behind that, but you still got to finish those races. And to be honest with you, out of the 5 drivers that swapped teams in 2021, I think Carlos Sainz was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was outperforming them straight off the bat, and that's where his professionalism comes in. For me, Carlos Sainz, the biggest thing for him is that he puts in the work, he puts in the hours, he understands what is needed from a Formula 1 driver, and he was at Maranello over the winter break, learning as much as he possibly could about the Ferrari team and about the Ferrari dynamics going into 2021, so that he could hit the ground running. And he definitely was the better of those drivers, especially in those first 10 races. Fernando Alonso got a little bit better towards the end of the season. Sergio Perez too got a little bit better towards the end of the season. But Carlos Sainz, straight off the bat, first race, was good in that Ferrari and carried that form throughout the entire season. And for me, I thought that was going to carry through into 2022. I thought, coming into 2022, new regulations, something new for all of these Formula 1 drivers to learn. Carlos Sainz seems like the kind of driver that would get that right. He would get it right straight off the bat and be ready to go into this 2022 season. But it just hasn't quite worked out like that so far. He's been beaten by Charles Leclerc in all 3 races this season. And we look at just the overall pace. Charles Leclerc even said himself in testing that these 2022 cars are a really big challenge in adapting into, and the racing style is completely different for these new cars. So how is it that Charles Leclerc has been able to get this advantage over Carlos Sainz? And it is quite a big advantage. If we look at Bahrain, qualifying pace, Carlos Sainz is off by a 10th. In terms of race pace, Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, even when they were battling at the front, Carlos Sainz is still losing time, losing tenths every single lap to those 2, even though they're swapping positions in turn 1 and turn 4. Obviously, the safety car at the end of the race kind of hid a few of those blemishes. The fact that he only finished 5 seconds behind Charles Leclerc was kind of only because of that safety car. It would have been a much, much bigger gap had that safety car not come in. Similar with Saudi Arabia, qualifying pace is 2 tenths off Sergio Perez, still a 10th and a half off of Charles Leclerc, and again, no race pace, losing 0.5 of a second to his teammate per lap at some points in that Grand Prix. And it just looks like Charles Leclerc is head and shoulders above Carlos Sainz at this moment in terms of both qualifying and race pace, which is something I wasn't really expecting. I think Carlos Sainz coming into this season, I'd expected a little bit more race pace from him, and Carlos Sainz saying himself that he's taken a little bit more time to adjust to this car, found that Bahrain Grand Prix the worst race that he's had for Ferrari since joining the team in 2021, and saying that actually he felt much better in Australia. And Australia looked like it could have been a turning point, and it looked like it could have been a point for Carlos Sainz to take a step forward. I even predicted that Carlos Sainz was going on to win the Australian Grand Prix, and maybe I jinxed him a little bit because it turned out to be the worst weekend he's had so far this season. Obviously, the red flag meters before the line in qualifying cost him from being able to qualify on the front two rows where we'd have expected him to be. Then, of course, he had another issue in qualifying, meaning he only had one outlap rather than two, couldn't get the temperature into those new Pirelli tyres, qualified in 9th place, which is not, what we expected from Carlos Sainz. But then it went from bad to worse for him in Australia as well. Had an issue with firing up the car in the garage and therefore had to change his steering wheel. The steering wheel, it was something to do with the anti-lock brakes, I think, needed changing, and the brake bias wasn't working, that button for him. So they decided to change the wheel. Carlos Sainz actually said that he did not want to change the wheel going at the start of the race, but Ferrari said, no, we need to change the wheel. We need to have this brake balance check and make sure that the wheel is working. The wheel wasn't set up for the start of the Grand Prix. And I think this is where we saw a completely different side to Carlos Sainz, and maybe one side of him that we haven't seen in his entire Formula One career so far. His wheel got changed. It then was wrong. And then he had the start where he just stalled. And obviously he dropped down to 13th, 14th, 15th place over the first lap because he was just standing still at the start of the Grand Prix and had to completely reset the car on the starting grid. Not something that you want to do as a Formula One driver whilst cars are zooming past you at hundreds of kilometers an hour. But I think this is where we saw an uncharacteristic side of Carlos Sainz. He was very impatient and you could tell was clearly frustrated, not only with the decision for Ferrari to change the wheel, but also the fact that it wasn't set up properly for him. It just seems like over the start of the season, this is only something that would happen to Carlos Sainz. I don't think this would ever happen to Charles Leclerc. And I think Carlos Sainz kind of feels that at this moment in time. And the pressure, obviously, of the fact that he's in a Ferrari, the biggest team in Formula One, in my opinion. The fact that Ferrari not only are now challenging for titles and Constructors' Championships, but wins on a regular basis. And he still hasn't been able to get that first win in Formula One, yet alone that first win with Ferrari. I think the smooth operator lost his head a little bit. And he said after the race, that he had to learn from this and said all of the media stuff that we expect from him. But I think we really saw a side of Carlos Sainz that might cost him over the course of the season. I think the pressure really got to him. I think he snapped, to be honest with you. Not only is Charles Leclerc, really stand out this season so far, but not putting a foot wrong at all in 2022, whilst Carlos Sainz is really struggling with that car, struggling to get his first win. It seems like Carlos Sainz, as I said, very impatient, very frustrated, tried to overtake Mick Schumacher where there wasn't really a gap, nearly hits into Valtteri Bottas, loses the car, beaches it, and then ends up not finishing the race. And the smoothness of Carlos Sainz that we expect, the level-headedness, the professionalism all went out of the window. And I think that pressure finally got to him. And I think, I think the fact that we're coming back to Europe and the fact we're going to Imola hopefully gives him a chance to just settle down a little bit, because I think that frustration could cost him over the course of the entire season and could turn as this Ferrari team continues to grow over the course of the season. Like if Charles Leclerc continues to eke out and Carlos Sainz starts to become a secondary driver and Ferrari start to treat him like a secondary driver, I don't know how well he'll take that, because he is just seemingly not adapting to the fact that he's come into this team, wanted to be the number one, did so well last season and hasn't been able to kick from that. Overall, Carlos Sainz, I think, will turn things around before the end of the season, probably will get his first win, but I'm not sure if he'll be able to overcome Leclerc, and I think Ferrari will start to use him for what they really wanted, to be honest. Ferrari were looking for a secondary driver for Charles Leclerc. I don't think Carlos Sainz wanted to be that, but he's kind of slowly becoming that. And let's talk about Sergio Perez, because Sergio Perez is a completely different dynamic. I think Sergio Perez knows he is a secondary driver in one margin or another. In Bahrain, though, had a really good Grand Prix, was fourth and should have probably come third had it not been for that mistake with Red Bull, and their powertrain just looks like it's going to fall apart in every single race this season. A fourth in Saudi Arabia, let's be fair, he should have gone on to win that race had it not been for Nicholas Latifi hitting the wall, and a second place in Australia, which puts him in fourth place in this Drivers' Championship so far. 30 points over 2 races that he's finished is not too bad at all. And I think, being the most experienced out of the 4 drivers we're talking about in those top 2 teams is slowly sort of working with, but also working against Sergio Perez. For some reason, the fact that he's most experienced and most competitive out of the Red Bulls so far in that 2022 car, I think has picked up, his first pole position, and people are still throwing at him that he's not a qualifier, or, he's better in the races and he's better at this, better at that. he's shown that he can qualify now, picked up his first pole position, and should have gone on to win that race. If that had been Max Verstappen, people would have been saying, oh, Max Verstappen would have picked up those 25 points, would have done this, would have done that, and would be talking about him in a little bit more of a positive light. Whereas for Sergio Perez, it was like, oh, it went wrong. He got 4th place overall, but he should be happy with that 4th place, really, shouldn't he? And I'm not so sure I follow that narrative in the same way that other people are pushing it. And always has been, Christian Horner has talked about the fact that they wanted a secondary driver to come into the team. They wanted to have a driver that would come in and be support for Max. And he definitely was that last year. But I think Checo's made huge steps forward in this 2022 car and looks really, really good under the new regulations. The thing for me, though, I think a better start to the season from Sergio Perez in comparison to his teammate, yet people are still talking about Max Verstappen as the clear favourite. His race pace compared to Verstappen is actually pretty good if you look at it. Comfortably holding that lead in Saudi Arabia. Didn't look like anybody was going to catch him, and he had a really, really good race pace in that one. Had a pretty good race pace in Bahrain. Had pretty good race pace in Australia. He was never going to catch Charles Leclerc in either of those scenarios. But again, his race pace is much better than the likes of Carlos Sainz, who we talked about earlier on. And the thing is, I think with Sergio Perez, the reason I don't think he's going to go on to win a championship, and the reason that I think the 2022 regulations, as much as he's adapted to them well, are going to cost Sergio Perez over the course of the season, is because of the brand new tyres. The 18-inch tyres have come in this season, and they just don't seem to degrade in the same way that we've had over the last few seasons. Like the medium, hard, and soft compound tyre all kind of grade and all kind of work in the same way. I mean, we've seen Alex Albon do 57 laps on the hard compound tyre in Australia. And the fact that he was able to do 57 laps on that hard compound tyre and actually set lap times which were comparable to some of the guys towards the front of the Grand Prix. Yes, Charles Leclerc probably took his foot off the gas a little bit, but Alex Albon in 10th place was matching him in terms of pace in terms of lap 50 to 57 of that hard tyre stint. Like, these hard tyres aren't degrading in the same way, and therefore tyre strategy is less of a thing this year. And we all know that Sergio Perez has been known as that tyre wizard over the course of his career. He's been able to do things on medium compound tyres, go super long, keep those tyres as fresh as they need to be. We saw him defend him from Lewis Hamilton last year in Saudi Arabia in Abu Dhabi, because he was able to keep those tyres fresh even though he was on a super long run in comparison to everybody else. And it's those things that I think are going to cost Sergio Perez. The fact that the tyres are slightly different this season, I could see it being a detriment to him. Maybe the tyres will change over the course of the season, but at this moment in time, I think that's one thing that they've taken away from Sergio Perez out of his arsenal that isn't going to be a standout over the course of this season. And with dramatic differences between the compounds kind of disappearing, like they're all fairly similar in terms of pace. We even saw George Russell qualify on the medium compound tyre in Saudi Arabia rather than the softer compound, and he was still able to get in and amongst that midfield pack. And it was just a little bit strange. Even with Lewis Hamilton in Saudi Arabia, you could say he wasn't able to smash through the field like we've seen before. We've seen Lewis Hamilton switch to a softer compound tyre. Everybody else was on the hard compound tyre towards the end of the race, and old hard compound tyres as well. Lewis Hamilton switches onto the medium compound and still doesn't have the pace to catch up with those harder compound tyre runners in front of him. I don't think there's that dramatic difference between the tyre compounds this year, and I think that will cost Sergio Perez over the course of the season because he's not going to be able to put in those long runs. He's not going to be able to hold on to the tyres in the same way that he was able to before, where he would have gone super long on a medium and you'd be completely shocked by his strategy. Now everybody's trying those strategies. Now everybody's going long on super compound tyres. We saw Lance Stroll try and go long. We saw Fernando Alonso try and go long on the hard compound tyre in Australia as well. And obviously, as I talked about, Alex Albon as well. So it's interesting that those two are kind of not in the mix for me. I think Carlos Sainz is more so in the mix, even though Sergio Perez has had a better start to the season. I can see Carlos Sainz turning it on a little bit towards the end of the season and maybe putting himself in there for wins a little bit more often, which seems... Actually, now I say it, a little bit counterintuitive because Sergio Perez probably should have a win this season already under his belt. But I just think that Ferrari is going to keep turning up. And with the 50-50 powertrain of Red Bull, I think Carlos Sainz is still going to finish in front of Sergio Perez. But I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Why are people not talking about Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz in the same breath as Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc? That's just my take on it and what I think so far over the course of just 3 races. 20 races still to go. There's a very, very long long way to go in this season indeed. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.